I'm delighted to have Sanjeev Joshipura with us today, who is Executive Director of Indiaspora. Founded in 2012, Indiaspora is a nonprofit organization established to transform the success of the Indian diaspora globally into meaningful impact worldwide. And their areas of focus includes philanthropy and social impact, serving as a global connector to top leaders within the diaspora community, US-India bilateral relations, and nonpartisan and civic engagement within the diaspora community in the US. Sanjeev has a background in public policy and business and has worked at Fortune 500 multinational organizations in different industries in the areas of strategy, finance, and project management. His work in public policy, American politics, and global government relations includes managing a US Senate election campaign, working as a staff member on Capitol Hill, advising congressmen and senators on economics and international affairs, and as the executive director of an international financial services industry association. Sanjeev, welcome.
Thank you, Noreen. Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, so let's just jump right into it, if that's okay. And perhaps we can start by defining the diaspora. As Pawan referenced, MIT in India is a good example of Indians seeking technological education here in the US. And that, for those that are interested, we can provide a reference later, but the Technological Indian, a book by Ross Bassett, highlights or documents well the MIT-India relationship. But we know that higher education is often a motivator within the diaspora, but there are others too. So could you share a little bit about, what makes that diaspora and how do we define them?
Absolutely, Noreen. There are different ways of counting the Indian diaspora depending on whether you talk about people who have emigrated directly from India or people that are born here to parents of Indian origin. So there are many different ways, but the generally recognized number is that there are 4.2 million people of Indian origin in America, and that is a little over 1% of the population. Now, the interesting thing is that this number has actually doubled, actually more than doubled, I should say, since 2000, and that makes the Indian diaspora one of the fastest growing minority populations in America. Now, you referenced education, and that is obviously very apposite given that we are at an MIT event with all these wonderful speakers that have preceded us. In the Indian diaspora, education is very highly valued, and the Indian diaspora is recognized as being highly educated. So 76% of the Indian diaspora in America have a college degree or higher, a bachelor's degree or higher. And also, they are among the highest median household income earners of any ethnic community in America. In fact, all over America, the Indian diaspora's median income is the highest, and it stands at approximately $120,000 US dollars per year. Now, having said that, it is also important to point out that that kind of blanket statement overlooks the fact that there are indeed some Indians in America. I use the word Indians loosely. What I mean is people of Indian origin. Some of them might have American citizenship, and other country citizenships as well. But 7.2% of the Indian diaspora in America, according to a report that was authored by Professor Devesh Kapoor at Johns Hopkins, have live in poverty, what is defined technically as poverty in America. And while that percentage is lower than Americans as a whole, it is important to point that out because it runs counter to the positive stereotype that Indian Americans have of being sort of this model minority. And just like, poverty in America on the whole, Indian American poverty as well tends to be concentrated among rural areas and inner cities, both. Just very quickly, in terms of the areas where Indian Americans reside, typically, they tend to be in New York, California, and to a large extent as well in Illinois and Texas and New Jersey as well. They're a fairly young population, with the median age among all Indian Americans being just 32, which is lower than I think Americans overall, which is closer to 38.
That's incredible. And we've also see a big, sort of shift across coasts, right? A lot of folks starting out on the East Coast and then later in their career or early in their career moving out to the West Coast, and a huge diaspora representation on the West Coast as well.
No question. That's exactly right. Especially in California in the tech industries, because technology education is something, STEM education is something that has been a strength of India. Pawan referred to IIT in Mumbai as sort of the shining example, but overall, technological education has been a strength, and so I guess they tend to gravitate towards the hub of innovation and technology on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm. And so, when we think about some of these cultural traits within the South Asian and particularly the Indian diaspora, what are some of those attitudes and traits, and how do they influence philanthropy in particular? Philanthropic giving within Indian communities varies, right? Both in the subcontinent as well as here in the US. And so, what are some of those traits that influence giving?
Yeah, so you're right, Noreen. Like we've already discussed, the Indian diaspora tends to really value education very highly. In fact, there was a Monitor of University Giving report that was released a couple of years ago by Indiaspora that shows that the Indian diaspora has donated over $1.2 billion to US institutions, educational institutions, since the year 2000. And this is only counting gifts of over $1 million. Wow. So anything under $1 million, we're not even counting in this number because there are far too many to document. So, this is just one sort of marker that is evident of the emphasis that the Indian diaspora lays on education. There is one other thing I would like to say, though, which is outside the realm of education necessarily, but in the under the overall rubric of, Indian diaspora philanthropy. The Indian diaspora more and more over time is being viewed as a diaspora that rises to the occasion to help out in crisis. Mm. So, for example, in 2020, and this is not a plug for Indiaspora, it's actually a plug for various other Indian diaspora organizations. We just happened to compile a report on it. Various Indian diaspora organizations, in fact, 58 of them just in America, repurposed their efforts in response to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And there was a program called Chalo Give. For those of you, on the call today who may not sort of be familiar with Indian languages, Chalo is let's go or let's do. So, let's give, Chalo Give was the name of the program. And within a 10-day period of the online program being launched, Indian diaspora in America donated $1.2 million, which resulted in the feeding of 8 million meals to hungry people during COVID that may otherwise not have received them. And the important thing I'd like to point out here is that you asked Noreen about how philanthropic attitudes are evolving and shifting. Over time, the Indian diaspora has come to recognize that while giving to India, of course, is important, it's not just about giving to India. It's also about giving where you live. And so this Chalo Give program, I mentioned 8 million meals. The $1.2 million that was donated in a period of 10 days was almost equally split, we found, between giving to food banks here in America and giving to an organization in India that was sort of the equivalent of running food banks in America. Mm-hmm. And so giving where you live is increasingly getting more and more popular among the Indian diaspora, especially as there are more people of Indian origin being born here in the US over time.
Right. And so that's really interesting, that combination of, being connected and grounded to where you are, where you physically reside now and identify as your community, but then also to India as well. And I'm just curious, outside of sort of natural disasters or crises that come up, what are other, and education, what are other areas that you've seen or trends of giving from the diaspora community, particularly here in the US or elsewhere back in India? What are the kinds of things that folks tend to be interested in supporting?
Right. And so, Noreen, just so I understand, your question relates to Indian diaspora giving to India or just in general?
Correct. In India specifically, yeah.
Yeah, in India specifically. Uh, outside of education, like I referenced, hunger and disaster relief, which we just discussed as well. Hunger alleviation is a big cause. There are various organizations in America that are focused on India, philanthropic organizations that work on hunger alleviation. And even within the education bucket itself, there are distinctions to be made in that there are several organizations that work at the primary education level. There are others that work at the secondary level. And then there are others that work even at a higher level in terms of universities and so forth. I'm talking about philanthropic organizations per se. So it is very varied in that sense. There are a couple of other areas that should be noted here. And I know that within philanthropic circles, this is an area of some dispute and controversy as to whether remittances count for philanthropy or not.
Sure.
But regardless of what one's view is on that specific subject, I think it's important just to raise the point of discussion just because of the amounts involved. Overall, I think India received about $68 billion from Indians worldwide in terms of remittances in 2019, I believe the numbers are. Of that 68 billion, about 13 billion are from America, Indians in America. Mm-hmm. And that is the second largest number outside of the United Arab Emirates. And so just given the size of that, I think it's important to note that. Now, the other thing too that I will mention is that, in terms of giving to India, I mean, this was a trend that we at Indiaspora, when we did our philanthropy research, we observed that for America as a whole, in the past, let's say about 25 years ago, approximately 75% of the giving that occurred was via religious institutions, so churches by and large. Now that number has significantly declined. Depending on what estimate you want to use, it's somewhere in between 30 to 40%. The same trend, I believe, holds for the Indian diaspora in terms of giving via or to religious institutions. So there is a lot of giving that the Indian diaspora in America engages in to India by way of giving to temples, mosques, churches, gurudwaras, etc. in India. This is my sort of hypothesis. I don't have, any statistical evidence to kind of prove it, but the trend of giving that I have noticed in the Indian diaspora over time would indicate to me that that percentage will decrease over time and will be replaced to some extent by giving to organizations that are involved in more sort of in the professional sector, if you will, whether it's skills, skilling, education, all of those kinds.
That's great. Yeah. And that really aligns with what, some of the types of organizations and the research that our students are involved with in India, and the faculty seed funds as well. So that's good to hear. Sanjeev, I'd like to kind of circle back to what you had talked briefly about earlier, and that generational shift. So here at MIT, as you can appreciate, we have a fair amount of Indian origin students who are probably second or third generation and are interested in traveling to India in a professional capacity. So for the most part, they've been back with their families, and that's obviously a very different experience. And so when they travel through MISTI, a MISTI program, that's the first time they're sort of traveling on their own, as it were, in a professional capacity. And we've had, a couple of students share their experiences, both in terms of identity and how they think about that and how they see that, and also, both personally and their professional aspirations, right? How that kind of going back to India sort of helps them sort of understand that moving forward as well. And so, drawing that back more broadly to a sort of generational shift. So as, these young individuals and students go into the workplace, and we're beginning to cultivate these experiences for them and these relationships, what are some of the trends you're seeing within the generational shift as it relates to philanthropy, and what can we be thinking about as well?
I'm glad you raised that particular question, Noreen, not only because of the fact that, as you mentioned, there's several second, third generation Indian students at MIT, which is outstanding, but also because in general, it aligns well with a finding that we had in a report that we did, Indiaspora did in conjunction with Dahlberg Consulting about 2 years ago on Indian diaspora philanthropy. And that report showed, we did an extensive survey, showed that the Indian diaspora typically tends to volunteer 2x of their time as compared to the average American in terms of philanthropic volunteering of their time. It's 2x. And the reason I mentioned that in the specific context of your question, Noreen, is because you're obviously talking about students who, typically at that stage of their lives, the majority of them would not be in a position where they are financially donating, thousands or millions of dollars to charity, but are indeed capable, if they so desire, of volunteering their skills and their time, which is kind of, I think, what you're alluding to. So it fits well with that finding in our survey. Now, in terms of things to keep in mind, there's a couple of things that come to mind right away. One is that even in India, I'm not just talking about diaspora philanthropy to India, I'm also talking about philanthropy within India. There will be a level of skepticism that they encounter when they go to India, especially to work on, sociological areas or anthropological areas, or even directly on philanthropy, sort of the humanities broadly speaking, I guess. And the reason for that is that there has been, and I'm sure you know this anecdotally as well, Noreen, is that there have been several instances, too numerous to sort of enumerate or elaborate on, of corruption in the philanthropic sector. And so there is a strong desire to make sure that organizations are vetted. I know earlier Eduardo mentioned the importance of the personal connection as being necessary but not sufficient when it comes to giving by the Latino communities here in America. I think that would also hold true for India. There is a strong emphasis in the culture on personal relationships and building those relationships. So that is something that your traveling students might want to keep in mind. Also, I think one of the things that we have noticed in the recent past more and more, as India's economy has advanced, from the early 90s on, when sort of India opened up its economy. Obviously, India is in a very different economic situation today than it was 30 years ago, and the changes for the better. As India's economy has advanced, there is a lot of pride in India, and therefore they, even the philanthropic organizations or the recipients of funds in India, or the partner organizations who benefit from philanthropy, don't want to be condescended to in any way, shape, or form. And we are noticing that in the sense that, the picture that those organizations want to paint in India, the philanthropic organizations, is one of opportunity, which is to say, just think if you could donate money to help this child, enter the professional world in a skillful way. And the hundreds of millions in India that are, at the cusp of that, and what that would mean for humanity as a whole if you could help them. And not, so that's the image, that's the zeitgeist, if you will, and not, painting pictures of, hungry street children, begging for money or that kind of thing. So in terms of the marketing or the fundraising, that is a sort of tonality that I think people would do well to keep in mind, whether it's students or on the ground volunteers or even philanthropic organizations devising their marketing plans.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, and I think we definitely the advantage we have there as a program is that we're really sort of embedded in the major areas of industry in within India, areas of growth, and having through our students, through the research and internships, having an impact there. So yeah, so that's great. So before we move to sort of Q&A, Sanjeev, I just wanted to ask if you might have any kind of, tips or do's and don'ts when we're thinking about culture and giving within the diaspora community.
Yeah, I'll just be fairly quick about this because I know that you want to leave Noreen time for Q&A at the end of this. I think if there is one, this question in and of itself is probably a discussion that could go on for an hour, but just in the interest of brevity, if there is one thing that I would encourage students to keep in mind, because I do recognize, of course, that MIT, like America, is a melting pot, and that there are students of all ethnicities and races and so forth, which is outstanding. And for those that are not necessarily very familiar with India, the one thing that I would say is that India is a bit of a miracle in history in the sense that it could easily have been 29 different countries and not just states of India. The cultures of each state, the cuisines of each state, the languages of each state, even within states, varies quite widely. And so I think one has to be careful about talking about India as a whole without disaggregating it into its parts. Because even on the Human Development Index, on economic indices, there is significant differences between various states in India or regions of India. And that's just something I would encourage students traveling to India to really keep in mind before forming their thoughts or their pitches or their plans about how they're going to do their work during their internship or whatever it is in India.